Welcome to Classic Paranormal, where we bring you true stories of the weird, strange, and otherworldly from works of literature from the past that time forgot. Don't forget to hit the share button to help promote this podcast. This is episode 2 of Hamlin Garland's 40 Years of Psychic Research, first published in 1936. Chapter 4. A Puzzled Physicist. All the way back to Boston, I pondered the significance of these amazing phenomena. I could not think of that little woman as a trickster, for I had full control of her. And yet to grant the playing of that piano meant a negation of all that I had been taught of space and matter. Had it happened in a prearranged room, the room of a friend, the case would be sound, for no one could have known that I would dictate the performance. No one could have predicted the tune I would whistle or the order in which I would ask for changes on the keyboard. The thing was impossible, and yet it happened. In my report to the directors of the society, I supplemented the report by saying, quote, "Here is a psychic made to our hands. She is deeply religious, but is willing to be tested in any way we can devise. No other medium that I have thus far met with has this willingness to be pitilessly investigated. She is willing that I shall apply any sort of test or manacle." End quote. As a result of this report, I was commissioned to secure Mrs. Smiley for a series of official scientific tests. According to my dated records, I met her in Chicago several months later and secured her promise to visit Boston. My recollection is that I was authorized to say that the board would pay her expenses from Chicago. I am quite certain that she made no charge then or thereafter for her services. In this she showed the spirit of the true evangelist. She came east early in November, and immediately after her arrival we announced a sitting in the editorial rooms of the Arena on Copley Square, and all the directors were present. With the cooperation of Mr. Allen, our secretary, I put the psychic under such test conditions as she had never known. She consented cheerfully. "All I ask," she said, "is that you give me at least 6 sittings before passing judgment on me." The first 2 or 3 sittings were almost barren of results, and the committee, as usual in such cases, lost faith in the psychic. They laid her failure to our severe control. Rappings and slight movements of the table were authentic, but feeble evidence of psychic power. Nevertheless, I refused to admit defeat even after 7 negative meetings. My experiences in California were too important to be disregarded, I argued. The room is unsuitable, and it may be that the psychic is too eager for results. Moreover, she is a Californian, and our cold weather may have weakened her energies. Notwithstanding my pleas, the chairman lost interest and turned the case over to me and to Dolbear, who surprised me by saying, "Bring your wonder worker up to my house, and we'll give her one more trial." To this he added, "As a thoroughgoing physicist, this is a grand concession." And so I considered it. From the printed report which I have before me, this sitting took place on November 10th, 1893. And the circle included Mr. and Mrs. Dolbear, Mrs. Smiley, and myself. The psychic was tense and somewhat awed, but Dolbear, genial and kindly, welcomed her cordially, and gentle little Miss Dolbear aided greatly in restoring her customary serenity. Dolbear, eager and interested as a young student, had carefully prepared his study for the experiment. He had darkened it by hanging shawls at the windows and had provided a wooden chair and a plain wooden table. His confidence in me and in my California report had led him to expect something out of the common. And although he left the actual control of the sitting to me, he supervised every detail with keen attention. Placing the psychic in an old-fashioned chair with flat armrests, I set about tying her wrists with silk twist. Using a spool of such thread, I passed a loop of it around her right wrist 6 or 8 feet from the end of the thread, and tied it in a square hard knot about the arm of her chair. Carrying the thread to her left wrist, I encircled it in the same manner. The spool end of the unbroken thread I handed over to Dolbear. I then tied a strong tape around each of her ankles, using the middle of an 18-foot tape. The ends of this tape I then brought through the rungs of her chair and nailed securely to the floor. She could not possibly reach these tacks directly behind her. Her chair was also tied with tape, and the 2 ends brought back and nailed firmly to a bookshelf about 8 inches from the back of her chair. It could not be moved forward. At Dolbear's suggestion, I then pinned a spread newspaper over the psychic's knees, tacking the edge of it to the floor. "Like the geese of Rome," said the professor, "this sheet will cackle a warning if you move." The reader should distinguish between these tyings and those which conjurers use on the stage. A silk twist cannot be untied by the fingers, even in daylight, and a newspaper once pinned intact cannot be moved in dark or daylight without noise. Furthermore, the reader should remember that this test was not made on a stage or in a seance room, but in the study of a distinguished physicist and writer on scientific subjects. The only door to this room was locked, and the key was in Dolbear's keeping. The only other person present was Mrs. Dolbear, a small, gentle, elderly woman to whom a sitting of this sort was unfamiliar. She was entirely passive in the trial. Mrs. Smiley, with an amused gleam in her eyes, sat quietly in her chair, expressing perfect confidence in me and acquiescence in my precautions. "You may put me in a wire cage if you want to," she said. "Other people have done that with me." On the table, which was square and fairly heavy, we laid pencils and paper, and at her request we placed upon it the long cone or megaphone which she always carried and which she guarded. She always used it in the belief that it had become magnetized by use. She had put a stream of cold water through it before turning it over to us. Mrs. Dolbear took a seat at the end of the table directly opposite Mrs. Smiley. Dolbear, who sat at her left, kept the spool end, whilst I at her right held the other end of this unbroken thread. The conditions were wholly ours, the control was in our hands, and when all were in readiness, the lights were turned out. At first, the room appeared almost perfectly dark, but as my eyes widened, a streak of light showed faintly in the window back of Dolbear. I could faintly distinguish the head of the medium. Joining hands with Mrs. Dolbear and touching Mrs. Smiley's wrists, we sat for 10 or 15 minutes quietly conversing. The psychic's right hand, which I was controlling, became cold and moist and at last drew away from my touch as far as the thread would allow. She did not speak, but it was evident that for some reason she wished us to remove our hands. She seemed at the same moment to fall into trance. With full trust in our bonds, we took our hands from her wrists. To Dolbear I then said, "I have released her hand, but I am holding my thread taut and I am resting the tip of my finger upon it. The slightest movement of her hand will be telegraphed to me." He replied, "I have the same arrangement." Raps now came upon the table, and the psychic, speaking with the voice of a little girl, her daughter Maud, said, "Mr. Mitchell would like to have you tie the threads to the legs of the table." Making no objection to this, we tied the ends of the thread which we had been holding to the table, which were fully 2 feet away from the utmost reach of the psychic's hands. We made no change in the knots about her wrists, and the newspaper was still on guard. After another period of silence, the psychic complained of the thread about her right wrist. I loosened this a bit, but to offset it, I tied another hard knot with doubled thread about this wrist. The second bond therefore added to her control rather than lessened it. The table at this time was more than 2 feet from her fingertips. As an hour or more passed without results, Dolbear began to lose hope of anything happening. He believed that our ingenious device of tying her with thread had made all movement impossible. I urged him to continue a little longer. At this point, our prisoner began to moan and writhe as if in pain, and after each paroxysm, in a dead silence, the table moved itself away from the psychic toward Mrs. Dolbear, who was at last forced to move backward. Each time the table moved, I listened for the crackle of the newspaper, but heard no sound. As the paper was tacked to the floor in front of the psychic's feet, which were also encircled by tape nailed to the floor, she could not possibly shove the table with her feet. With a note of amazement in his voice, Dolbear called out, "The cone is rocking." Taps now came on the table, which was fully 3 feet from the psychic's manacled hands, and we heard the pencil rattling against the table as though fumbled by clumsy unseen fingers. "Is it Wilbur?" I asked. The pencil tapped briskly 3 times. "Yes." "Can you write for us?" 3 taps. "Yes." At this point, to the astonishment of Dolbear as well as of myself, something fell upon the table. I felt for it and reported that it was a book. "It must have been taken from the shelves back of the psychic," I said, "and it certainly was carried over our heads." Other volumes followed rapidly, a bombardment of them, till something like 24 were piled upon the table about the cone. Strange to say, the cone was not disturbed by the books which came whizzing over our heads. None of them struck the cone so far as I could judge from the sound. "Note this, Dolbear," I said. "In order to bring those books, normally the psychic must free her hands, twist about in her chair, reach back of herself, and pick them from the shelves." He did not reply, so deeply was he puzzled by these unexpected, seemingly impossible phenomena. At my suggestion, Mrs. Dolbear now made a test of the mysterious agent. She said, "There is a small candy box on the shelf above the books behind Mrs. Smiley. I wish you would bring it to me." "That is a preposterous request," protested Dolbear. But a moment later the box was laid upon the table and shoved down against Mrs. Dolbear's hand, who identified it. Dolbear was silent. Addressing the guide, I then said, "Wilbur, I want you to write your name in one of those books." After a vigorous clicking of the cone, apparently with a pencil, the sound of writing was plainly heard on the pad a full yard from the psychic's fingers. For a few minutes, all movements halted. The light from the window back of Dolbear was much stronger now. And as another test of the invisible, I said, "Wilbur, I want you to show me your hand. Pick up a book and hold it between me and the window." Instantly, and to my amazement, a book appeared in the air several feet above the table, plainly outlined against the streak of light. I called out, "Dolbear, I can see 2 hands holding a book. They are thumbing the leaves. Can't you hear them?" Dolbear, with his back to the window, could not see the hands, but he said, "I hear the rustle of the leaves." The thump of the book as it returned to the table was heard and reported by us both. "Now show me your empty hand, your right hand," I demanded. A shadowy hand appeared between me and the light and waved up and down thrice. "Dolbear," I called out, "I see a huge hand in the air above you. It is 3 times the size of the psychic's hand. The fingers are spread wide and are pointing toward the psychic. It is a man's hand, and it comes from the direction of Mrs. Dolbear and is fully 3 feet from the psychic's left hand. The wrist and elbow are over the table. Such a position is impossible for the medium's normal arm." Dolbear coldly replied, "I see nothing from my side." This aroused Wilbur to give further evidence of his presence. The cone with the ringing scrape now rose high in the air, and a man spoke to us as clearly as if he were a living being. "I told you I'd astonish you," he said. "Don't get in a hurry, there's more coming." For 2 mortal hours, this invisible kept us wondering at his power and laughing at his wisecracking. He was philosophic as well as humorous. At intervals, he played jokes upon us. At my request, he touched my face on the side away from the psychic and 6 feet from her. As a still stronger test, I asked that the small end of the cone touch me on the right nostril. This was done with such gentle precision that it seemed to caress. I then said, "Cover my right ear with the big end of the cone. This will bring the small end of the horn toward Mrs. Dolbear." The horn reversed itself and covered my right ear with the larger end. This it did gently, yet unerringly. To do this fraudulently, the psychic would have required both hands and entire freedom from her chair. She could not handle the cone in her position. To my thinking, she did not so much as touch it. The pressure upon my nostril in the dark was a miracle of exactness. "Dolbear," I said across the table, "what can you say of this cone and its voice? And what about the skill of the movement shown by the invisibles? Apparently, darkness is no barrier to the action of these agents. That horn touched me just as I directed it to do, and with unerring swiftness. It came to my call like a sentient thing, with supernormal capabilities. Could any trickster perform under our control such miracles of delicacy and precision? What is the power which directs this instrument? Can you tell us, Wilbur?" A chuckle came from the horn. "I'm doing it." "How can you see us to do it?" His reply was instant. "Day and night are all the same to me." Dolbear interrupted. "Prove it." "I am holding my right hand high in the air. Touch my knuckle." I heard a light bang, and Wilbur called out with a laugh in his voice, "What made you jump?" Dolbear explained that the cone had banged his left hand. In all that he said and did, Wilbur gave me the impression of a rollicking Western and Southern man, yet he flitted like a shadow from point to point in the room. He was disposed to have fun with us. He was as real as any person in the dark could be. He responded to every question with readiness and humor. He continued to play jokes on us. He bumped Dolbear on the head and caressed Mrs. Dolbear gently on the temple. At my command, he covered her right ear with the broad end of the trumpet. This brought the small end 6 feet from the psychic and at right angles to her. He interested me as a personality. "Who are you?" I asked. "Is Wilbur your family name?" "No, my middle name," he breezily replied. "My full name is Jefferson Wilbur Thompson." "What did you do when on the Earth plane?" "I was a soldier." "In the Civil War?" "Yes." "On which side?" He hesitated a moment, chuckled softly, and said, Now, that's a leading question. Oh, come, the war is over." As if throwing aside restraint, he briskly replied, "I was on the southern side, a brigadier general." "Where were you killed?" "I was invalided home to Jefferson City and passed out there." "How did you happen to become a guide to this little woman?" He hesitated again. "I was attracted to her," he replied, and gave no further explanation. At this point, the psychic's other guide, Mitchell, took the megaphone and gave us a formal oration. He said in substance, "We are deeply interested in your experiments, Mr. Garland, and we will afford you all the aid in our power. It is hard to meet our tests. Hard, I mean, for our medium. But we will assist her to fill the requirements and save her from injury." To this I replied gravely, "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I don't see how any psychic could be more submissive. She has won the respect of all her members." Mitchell was quite as real as Wilbur and as fully characterized, but less amusing. He was disposed to discuss basic principles with me and to argue the need of faith. Wilbur may be said to represent the jovial side of the medium, Mitchell her serious sub-self. Now came a new force. The table was grasped and shaken violently from side to side as if by a powerful, impatient man. And yet the newspaper on the psychic's knees uttered no sound, and the threads tied to the chair legs remained unbroken. Such violent side-to-side motion requires 2 hands. This astonishing demonstration was followed by the sound of hands beating a pillow on the couch directly behind Dolbear, and wholly out of reach of the psychic's left hand even if free. Mrs. Dolbear then said, "Bring the pillow to me." The pillow was lifted and beaten violently in the air as if to indicate that 2 hands were in action. It was then tossed against the back of Dolbear's chair. In all these phenomena, the intent apparently was to prove that the psychic could not possibly have any normal hand in them. The invisibles cooperated with us with cheerful readiness. So far as the senses of hearing and feeling go, Mrs. Smiley remained in deathly trance. I listened intently but heard no sound from her. While the movements were going on, she was absolutely silent, but after each demonstration I could hear her troubled breathing. Perfectly certain that she had not stirred, I said, "Dolbear, our victim has not moved an inch. She is right where we placed her." Having demonstrated the telekinetic power of their instrument, the invisibles now returned to the cone, and Mitchell, the elderly pedantic speaker, again addressed himself to me, saying very seriously, "Your aid is welcome, and we are sure that great results will flow from your experiments." He promised me the aid of all his allies and urged me to keep on, but quote-unquote, be considerate of our instrument. So clear was my concept of him that I answered him precisely as I would have spoken to an elderly college professor. Mrs. Dolbear, who had herself fallen into trance, now became clairvoyant. She declared that she could see forms moving about the room, and a voice then spoke to her, giving a name which I could not hear but which she said she recognized. She addressed this person as a relative and conversed with him for some time. Dolbear was also addressed by a voice, but not very clearly, and at last a very faint whisper came from the cone to me, giving the name of one of my dead sisters. The psychic knew nothing of my sisters. The cone moved freely over the pile of books, always without jar or confusion, and at last broke itself in two pieces and fell upon the floor. This ended the séance. Asking Dolbear to turn the lights on slowly, I minutely examined Mrs. Smiley. She was sitting precisely as we had confined her. The newspaper was still on guard, the threads about her wrists were unchanged. But strange to say, the threads which we had tied to the table legs were taut. The table had been pushed to the extreme limits of the threads, 2 feet beyond the utmost reach of her hands or feet. I called Dolbear's attention to this. If the psychic had freed her hands and pushed the table away first, she could not have loosened the threads to slip her hands back into the loops. If she slipped her wrists back into place, she could not have shoved the table away to make the threads taut. All of which argues that the table was moved by some supernormal force. Upon close examination, I found her wrists much swollen. The silk threads were deep sunk into her skin and could hardly be seen. To cut them required care. Her pulse was irregular and very faint. For a few minutes, I could detect only a feeble, sluggish throb at long intervals, followed by a rapid fluttering so feeble that I was unable to count the pulsations. Her hands were cold and clammy, and her arms inert as lead. In truth, she resembled one returning from a death-like swoon. Following her murmured directions, I placed one hand against her forehead and the other at the base of her brain. This action seemed to help her. Her voice came back, her pulse steadied. But it was nearly half an hour before she could use her limbs. "Did anything happen?" she asked. "A whole lot happened," I replied. She professed to know nothing of her groaning and very little of what had taken place. She rose at last and, leaning heavily on Mrs. Dolbear, left the room. After the two women had passed into the hall, I closed the door of the study and challenged Dolbear. "What are you going to do with these facts? Whence came those huge hands? Who transported the trumpet? Who brought the candy box?" He slumped into the chair to which the psychic had been lashed and stared at the books on the table. "I don't know what I'm going to do with them," he replied in a tone of complete bewilderment. At that moment he granted the psychic's honesty and acknowledged the reality of her amazing powers. How could he deny the evidence? 24 books lay piled on the table. Hypnotism could not account for them. And more incredible than all, Wilbur's signature was in one of the books along with a message from Mitchell and other invisibles. If she could have freed her hands, Dolbear mumbled feebly, she could have reached the books. But she did not. She could not possibly have gotten out of those loops of silk thread. And if she had done so, she could not have gotten back into them. What are we to say about those two huge hands? What about the one with the fingers pointing toward her face? Those fingers might have been yours. They were not Mrs. Dolbear's, and they were not mine. The psychic's hands remained exactly where we put them. They did not move. He did not answer, and I went on. What about the voices? What about the amazing force which shook the table from side to side 3 feet away from her? Why didn't the paper crackle when the table was being shaken? Not a sound came from the psychic, even when the books were arriving. What more can you demand? You prepared this room before she had so much as crossed its threshold. Handcuffs or an electric wire would not have been more faithful than our thread and tape and tacks. Barring the darkness, you and I have had things all our own way, and yet the woman met our tests. For an hour we argued, measured distances, and discussed possibilities. At the end of it all, we agreed that the psychic had triumphed over us and our control. "It is not a question of one sitting," I finally said. You must remember that I've had 10 or 12 sittings with this psychic. I had a still more marvelous demonstration in Los Angeles when a closed piano played to my dictation. Dolbear sat like a man who had been dealt a stunning blow. It is all preposterous, impossible. There must be some natural way of explaining it. There is no place for the supernatural in my world. What about the supernormal? The possibilities of unknown biodynamic forces are infinite. If she will permit me to hold her hands while the cone moves, I will surrender. Oh no, you won't. You think you will, but you won't. You can't believe till a certain weight of evidence brings conviction. To quote another doubter, your doubts are not due to any defect in any actual experiment, but to the inexorable strength of prepossession which holds you back from acceptance of the phenomena we have witnessed. In your book on matter and motion, you reduce all substances to assemblies of whirls of energy. Is there no place there for the forces we have felt tonight? What can you say in explanation of those silk manacles deep sunk in the woman's wrists? Did she simulate that? What about the candy box coming to your wife from a shelf? What about the hands beating the pillow in the air? I confess I took a malicious delight in cataloging these preposterous facts. Dolbear remained silent, sprawled out in the chair which the psychic had occupied, his mind so involved with the problems presented that he hardly heard my parting word. It was a deliciously clear and weirdly still midnight, and as I walked down the hill to the streetcar, I looked up at the glowing stars and asked myself, can it be that the good old theory of the constitution of matter is about to be revised? What is a silk thread, anyhow? That Dolbear was still seated in his study, pondering the implications of what he had seen and heard, I could not doubt. But of his willingness to carry his conviction to his laboratory on the morrow, I was not so certain. He is shaken, astounded, almost convinced. But as he meets his fellow instructors, he will not mention any of these baffling phenomena. Or if he does, he will jest about them. They will have taken on the fantastic character of a dream. Chapter 5. The Impossible Happens. Flower was delighted with Mrs. Smiley's success in Dolbear's study and highly amused when I described the professor's bafflement. It is almost impossible for a physicist to accept a result of any experiment, one factor of which is the human soul, said Flower. He will admit that he knows nothing of an acid or a salt, except that it does so and so. But when he witnesses a series of spirit phenomena, he is quick to deny the reality of what he sees. I hope the professor will follow this up, but I am not very hopeful of it. Nevertheless, he did. He came into town several times to our sittings in Flower's office. But alas, for some reason our psychic's powers suddenly failed. And even Dr. Savage began to question the value of further experiment with her. Alan, Flower, and I, however, remained loyal to our promise, and I did my best to keep Dolbear on the committee. You must remember, I argued, that the bleak climate of Boston has weakened our medium. She is plainly less robust than when she came to us. Certainly, the control in your library was quite as rigid as in any of these later tests, and yet the phenomena were marvelous. Furthermore, there is something in the air of a business office, like this of the arena, which is antagonistic to subjective action. I wonder that we can get anything from our psychic in such circumstances. We are not dealing with acids and carbons, but with an extremely subtle problem, one side of which is a delicate feminine organism, and the other a changing mixture of discordant personalities. In spite of our determined use of literal brass tacks and rolls of tape, there have been inexplicable movements of the table and other objects. I do not despair of valuable results. At the end of my plea, Dolbear was moved to say, I would like to have one more sitting in my library to see if your psychic can duplicate the marvels of her seance there. This was arranged a few days later with conditions of control about as before, but the phenomena were rather disappointing. No voices came from the cone, but the table moved under absolutely test conditions. Dolbear had taped Mrs. Smiley's feet and hands, placed luminous stars on her knuckles, and nailed the hem of her dress to the floor. And yet, in spite of these precautions, the heavy table moved, sliding by short impulses, and in dead silence, away from the medium whose hands and feet could not stir. The newspaper which we had tacked over her knees remained silent, and the luminous paper stars did not even waver. I was still expectant of more powerful action when Dolbear, thinking he saw the star move, jerked the thread which ran from her wrist to his thumb and fingers. The psychic at once began to twist and sigh, and the voice called Maudie said, Mama has been hurt by Professor Dolbear's thread. The sitting must stop. On lighting the room, we found the psychic exactly as we had bound her, every tack in place and the table entirely out of her reach. But she was suffering from a cramp in her left arm and side, and fully half an hour passed before she could stand and walk. Dolbear was apologetic, but nothing could be done. The sitting was spoiled. he said. I begin to wonder if the books did fly from my shelves on the night of our famous sitting. I laughed at him. You know they did. You're only puzzled by a novel problem. As for myself, I cannot suspect our gentle little Californian of conscious deceit. She has put herself at our disposal and is ready for any test. We can't stop here. We can't ignore what happened at previous tests just because other sittings are partial failures. We must go on with other tests. He agreed to meet with me once more, and I arranged to circle at the home of my friend Dr. Tompkins, one of our associates in Jamaica Plain. By this time, I had become convinced that our medium was much more than a passive instrument. I believed that results were related in some subtle way to the sitters as well as to her own mental and physical state. I observed that when she was worried or when any of us were physically uncomfortable, nothing happened. The forces, whatever they are, come not only through her, but from her, I argued. We are all parts of the machine. For example, if our psychic knows that someone must leave the seance in order to catch a train, her power weakens. We must keep her serene. The next sitting was in Dr. Tompkins' home in Jamaica Plain, and the Dolbears, despite my warning, announced to Mrs. Smiley's hearing that they must leave early. They were not only uneasy, they worried our psychic. Nothing happened while they were present, but after they were gone, leaving no one but Mrs. Tompkins and myself, Maudie spoke to me saying, "Put Mama in a wooden chair and take the cone apart. Put the small end on the table." This I did, and immediately Wilbur spoke to me through the trumpet. "Tie the psychic as before," he said. "Oh no," I said. "Let things go as they are. I am content with previous tests." "No, make this test. Confine the medium as you usually do. Nail her to the chair." Sensing something important in this, I knotted the tape about the psychic's wrists as before, and drawing both ends taut under the tip of my finger, took my seat at the small table. Again, the voice of Wilbur was heard. "Nail the psychic to the arms of her chair," he urged. "I am satisfied," I replied. With no one but my friend Mrs. Tompkins, a clear-eyed investigator with a doctor's training, I sat with the small end of the cone almost in the hollow of my left arm. I could detect no slightest movement in the tapes which I held, and yet the cone at once rose from the table and was drummed upon as if to show two hands in action as it moved over my head. A few moments later it caressed my cheek. Wilbur's voice, strong, vital, humorous, came from it, and for an hour we conversed as readily, as logically as if he were a human being. And at the precise instant that he was speaking, my faithful tapes remained taut over my finger. No slightest movement in her hands was communicated to me, but just before each flight of the horn she shivered convulsively. While the cone was in the air, she was as still as the dead. My impression was, my belief at the moment was, that she had nothing to do in any normal way with the voices or with the flight of the horn. If there is any virtue in tacks or woven cotton, she did not raise her arm so much as an inch from her chair. Then at my very elbow stood Wilbur, invisible yet audible, as vocal as Mrs. Tompkins. Then came Mitchell, the elder guide, who greeted me with old-fashioned courtesy. "We approve every test you are putting upon her instrument," he declared. "Let me assure you that she will yet triumph over Professor Dolbear. Conditions have been unpropitious. The sitters have been too often changed, and the places of meeting have not been well chosen." "You are quite right," I replied. "I realized all along that conditions were wrong, but could not bring the directors to my way of thinking. I shall do my best to secure better conditions hereafter. All must be harmonious and unhurried," he went on. "Do not be discouraged. Our instrument is adequate." I admitted that I had been a bit discouraged. However, this sitting has given me new interest. I shall be faithful to the end. These two voices were as perfectly characterized as if they had come from two separate bodies. They were as distinctly individual as the voices of Dolbear and Flower. Mitchell, grave, scholarly, considerate, was in direct contrast with Wilbur, whose talk was vivid, rollicking, waggish. There was something serious under all this jesting, however. In a momentary silence, I said to Mrs. Tompkins, "I am closer to a solution of this problem at this moment than ever before in my life. Here in the crook of my elbow, the incredible is happening. I feel that if I could turn on the light, Wilbur and Mitchell would stand revealed. My faith in the supernormal powers of our psychic is completely restored." The reader will say, "Why not turn on the light?" I answer, for the reason that if the psychic's etheric double was abroad in the air, as seemed probable, white light would be to her a serious physical shock. She had submitted to all my restrictions, and having her under bonds, I was willing to accept the darkness, for the time. Of my conversation with these invisibles, I retain only a general impression that it was highly intelligent, and that it dealt mainly with the methods which should be used in future tests and warnings that we must not put too great a strain upon our medium. The talk of spirit plane and spirit action was, as usual, vague and of slight value to science or to literature. It all seemed an echo of the medium's thought or of my own. It was the physical or metaphysical problem which absorbed my interest. At the conclusion of the sitting, we found Mrs. Smiley in a deep trance, very white and weak, her hands hanging limply over the arms of her chair. She was cold, inert, and mentally confused. She knew very little of what had taken place and was cheered by my assertion that it had been a success. The 12 succeeding sittings were almost barren of results, and my belief in Mrs. Smiley was sorely tried. In truth, all the directors save only Flower, Allen, and myself lost interest and failed to attend our meetings. Flower was positive that as soon as our psychic recovered her health, her power would return. I agree with you that it is our duty to give her every chance to make good. Mrs. Smiley was in great distress of mind over the situation. "I guess I'm no good anymore," she said pathetically. "I never sit now without a fear that my power may be gone forever. Your eastern climate is so harsh. I long for my home in California." "But don't give up yet," she pleaded. "You have done your part," I assured her. "We do not forget what you have already done. We are going on." Mrs. Flower now came to the rescue. "Why not meet in our home next time? We will sit in a warm, quiet room, and we will have no one in the circle but ourselves and Mr. Garland." She appointed an afternoon for the sitting, and as Allen, the secretary of the society, found it possible to be present, he and I arranged the room and confined the psychic. Our control was more rigid than ever. I am aware that all the description of control is repetitious and boresome, but with our critics in mind, it is necessary that I should repeat each time the exact process of nailing the psychic to her chair and her chair to the floor. As an additional precaution, Mrs. Flower suggested stitching the tape to the psychic's sleeves. No one can assert that the psychic could unstitch herself. "Capital," I exclaimed. When she had finished this stitching, I drove a long brass tack through the psychic's tight sleeve, and also through the double and stitched tape. It was impossible to escape from these bonds. They were surer than a steel bracelet. There were no trick knots, no duplicate keys, no hinged handcuffs in the arrangement. She could not pull those tacks, draw those stitches, or if she did, she could not replace them. Not content with these precautions, however, Flower knotted a second tape about each of her wrists. "They will take off the strain," he said, "and prevent any unconscious movement from pulling the tacks." To keep our psychic from sliding down in her chair, we pinned a long tape to her dress just below her knees and, drawing the ends together, knotted them to the back rung of her chair. As a final precaution against the use of her feet, we nailed the front hem of her skirt to the floor with 3 stout tacks. With a chuckle in his voice, Flower then said, "Now let the ghosts walk." Although a convinced spiritualist, he was an admirable investigator, as was Allen, who likewise urged me to employ every precaution, every device mainly, I think, in order to see me confounded by phenomena which all my relentless care would fail to prevent. On the table we placed 5 or 6 sheets of paper and a pencil. Then, taking the cone apart, I put the small end of it on the table and set the larger end on the floor beside Flower. It was about 3 o'clock of a winter afternoon as we drew the curtains and took our seats. The fire was flickering fitfully in the open grate, but otherwise the room was fairly dark. It was a roomy chamber on the 2nd floor of the mansion, which stood in an ample lot. Here I must emphasize the fact that our circle this night consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Flower, Secretary Allen, the psychic, and myself. No stranger was present, and the control was more rigid than at any previous sitting. Excepting the darkened room, conditions were perfect for a test of phenomena. Flower controlled Mrs. Smiley's right hand, I her left. Having been chief inquisitor of this little woman for nearly 30 test circles, I developed apparently the ability to throw her into a deep sleep almost immediately. A few moments of monotonous humming while my hand lay on her wrist sufficed to bring on the first stages of her trance. I had adopted the theory that it was in this first and lightest state of coma that she spoke unconsciously and wrote automatically, and that it was only in the second and profounder trance that she became possessed of certain telekinetic powers, and that in the third, death-like and almost breathless, pulseless state, her etheric self, let us say her spirit double, wrote on a pad, spoke from the trumpet, and touched us with invisible hands. That this etheric self was thus at work was not a conviction, a belief. It was only a surmise, born of my reading and sustained by certain phenomena which I had many times obtained under control. After we had been sitting an hour, I began to chant my potent monotonous spell. In a few moments she sank into what seemed like profound slumber. She gave no answers to my questions, and premonitory tremors, which I had before noted, developed in her hands. These were followed by a slight convulsive straining movement of her arms. The hand I held grew hot, and her fingers vibrated swiftly as if with intensive electrical energy. 10 minutes later, all motion ceased. Her temperature abruptly fell. Her breathing became tranquil, slowing down from moment to moment till at last it stopped. So far as I could detect, she ceased to breathe. At this moment, the sweet childish voice of Maudie came apparently from the psychic's lips. "Mr. Mitchell wants Mr. Garland to change places with Mr. Flower. Be very careful as you move about. Don't joggle Mama. It is very dangerous to her." As we rose to comply, the voice went on. "Mr. Mitchell wants the threads fastened to Mama's wrists. He wants you and Mr. Flower to hold them the way you did at Professor Dolbear's house." Turning on a soft light, we tied a strong silk thread to each of the motionless woman's wrists and passed the ends under the chair arms. Flower then took one of these and I the other. I called Alan's attention to the fact that the table at the moment was 17 inches from the utmost reach of the fingers of the psychic, and that all our tacks were in place. Maudie then said, "Put the pieces of the cone together and place the cone on the floor by the table." Flower did this and drew a chalk mark around the legs of the table, numbering it position 1. Immediately on our return to our seats, the table moved away from the psychic an inch or two at a time till it rested against Mrs. Flower's knees. "Do you feel any motion in your thread?" I asked Flower. "Nothing but a faint quiver." He went on to say, "I cannot imagine how a thought can be transferred into muscular energy even in the simplest everyday action. And here we have this table moved at least 2 feet from the psychic's knees while her skirt edge is nailed to the floor. So far as matter can testify, Mrs. Smiley is not concerned with these movements of the table." At this moment, the psychic began to stir. "Look out," I called warningly. "Let every hand be accounted for. Some new demonstration is preparing." In this hush, the cone was lifted as if by a feeble, fumbling hand. "Keep test conditions," I urged. "Don't make a movement without announcing it." I then addressed the invisible. "Wilbur, see if you can handle the cone under these rigid conditions. Come now, lift it, lift it." Twice the horn rose from the carpet only to fall back helplessly. Each time Flower replaced it, he marked its new position with chalk. After each fall of the cone, the psychic writhed and moaned as if in agony. Not till the hush of apparent death again came over her did the horn begin to move. So intense was the silence of these moments that we could hear the slightest breath and the slightest scraping of the cone on the carpet. At last it rose in the air, soared over our heads, and was lowered softly to the table. It did not fall with a bang. It came to rest gently as if under control, not only of a hand, but of a brain which could see and accurately measure distances. It is of no value to accuse our circle of cheating. None of us moved, and the psychic could not possibly have lifted that cone to the table. So far as my hearing goes, and according to the testimony of the thread, the psychic had nothing to do normally with that movement of the horn. She is as silent and as motionless as a corpse. Flower corroborated this statement. "I feel nothing but a minute continuous tremor in the thread," he added. "We are all in some way and varying degree concerned in these movements," I said. "There is no use in denying the facts presented. Either the psychic is able to put forth an etheric limb and to direct its action, or an entire etheric body is abroad in the room, a sentient entity, capable of speaking, of seeing in the dark, and of raising that piece of tin." Flower laughed. "It is easier for me to imagine that Wilbur did it." "I can't follow you there," I replied. Notwithstanding my theorizing, my mind was clear and my senses unusually alert. I allowed nothing to escape me. A curious interruption now took place. The psychic again began to twist about and moan, and Maudie asked, "Is Mr. Garland going to take a train at 7 o'clock? This question convinced me that deep down in the mind of the psychic lay the disturbing memory of a remark I made about catching a certain train. To remove her uneasiness, I now replied, "No, I'm going to stay, for I think Mitchell has some special phenomena in store for us." We had been sitting for nearly 3 hours when Maudie said, "Mr. Mitchell thanks you and says you are now to go down to dinner. Leave Mama just as she is. He will take care of her." This was a surprising request. I hesitated. To leave this little woman nailed to her chair, hungry, thirsty, and stiff with 3 hours of immobility is cruelty to a martyr. Flower replied, "Mitchell and Wilbur know what they're doing. Let's follow directions." At the dinner table I remarked, "If Mrs. Smiley is doing this for her own entertainment, she has a singular taste in amusement. If she is doing it to advance the cause, she is a devoted martyr. The skeptic will say that she is now seeking to free herself from the bonds, but nothing can invalidate what has already taken place. The lifting of that cone from the carpet is a physical problem of enormous importance." Our meal was a hurried one. In less than a half an hour, we were again in the seance chamber. Our first care was to examine our psychic's bonds. We found them precisely as we had left them, and the psychic apparently in deep sleep. She could not have unstitched and restitched herself. Every stitch was unchanged. Picking up the threads attached to her wrists, Flower and I resumed our places so that the four of us formed a crescent at the end of the table, directly opposite and 2 yards from the psychic. This position, says Flower, makes us one pole of a battery of which the psychic is the other. Hardly were we in our places when the psychic awoke and spoke in her natural voice. I was disappointed, for I considered this the end of our sitting. Convinced as I was that the most important phenomena happened only when she was in a death-like state of trance, I was confounded by what followed. All my theories were upset. While the cone rose in the air and while voices came through it, Mrs. Smiley was not only awake, but took a lively and wholly natural part in all that went on. She said, "I'm numb, but I'm not in pain, and my mind is clear." To judge from her voice, she was making no effort to produce or change the action of the invisibles. Once or twice, Mrs. Flower said, "I hear the sound of lips whispering, but it is outside the cone." At last the whispering came from the cone and said, "I hear the name of my father." She spoke to this invisible who identified himself to her. Some of her questions he answered correctly, but some he failed to answer. This ended the phenomena. At the close of the sitting, we were delighted to find the sheets of paper which we had placed on the table filled with writing. These sheets lay with their bottom ends toward the psychic and wholly out of her reach. The critic must therefore shift his charges from the psychic to some one of us. The messages had very little value to any of us, but the method of their production was inexplicable. To Mrs. Smiley I said, "At our next test, I want to control both your hands and my big fist at the precise moment when the cone is being lifted, or when the writing is going on." "You may make any test you please," she quietly replied. "The critic will say that the darkness and the break in the continuity of the sitting invalidate it. But this I do not grant. Suppose the psychic had unstitched and restitched herself in our absence. We re-examined every stitch and tack and found them in place, and we took control of the threads just the same after the intermission as before. If matter exists at all, if thread and tacks have any integrity whatsoever, that woman had no hand in what took place before or after dinner. I cannot affirm that she was wholly ignorant of Mrs. Flower's father's name and character, but I trusted in the watchful care of our tapes and tacks." Chapter 6. Spectral Drumbeats. The results of this sitting at Flower's house were so valuable that we arranged to meet in the same room at the same hour a few days later. All the precautions and controls of the first meeting were exactly duplicated in the second. And in addition, Mrs. Flower sewed 2 bands of tape around the psychic's sleeves, and 4 tacks were drawn down through both tape and sleeves deep into the arms of her chair. It is important to state that as Alan was not able to be with us, our circle was narrowed to Flower, Mrs. Flower, and myself. "Whatever happens this afternoon," I said to Flower, "you or Mrs. Flower or I must be held responsible." "Why leave out Dr. Mitchell and Wilbur?" retorted Flower. Wonders began to happen immediately. The cone, at a distance of nearly 4 feet from the psychic's manacled hands, was lifted and tapped, keeping time to our singing. Later, strange noises like the beating of a kettle drum were heard, and the sound of hammering came apparently from inside the cone, all absolutely out of reach of the psychic's hands. This spectral drumbeat was wholly unexpected and enormously impressive to me. Its value as evidence of supernormal force is very great. With no outsider to accuse of trickery, I listened to the sounds in amazement, but with keen ears. There was nothing in the room, nothing within reach of Mrs. Smiley which might have given out that strange noise. It was wholly unlike the metallic clinking which had been coming from the cone. It was a dull, distant booming sound, and yet it was in the room. True, we were dependent on our sense of hearing alone, but we all agreed that it was not an outside noise. The reader may say, "You imagined it," and I can only retort, we did not imagine the movement of the trumpet, for we found it in a different spot from that on which we placed it. I am certain we did not imagine the drumbeat, for we all heard it at the same time and remarked upon it. It had never happened before, and I may add, it never sounded again. At last the psychic impersonating Maudie spoke. "Go down to dinner, leave Mama just as she is. We will take care of her." We were in the midst of a most interesting series of phenomena at the moment. Movements and sounds were being produced beyond the utmost reach of the psychic, and I was reluctant to leave the room. However, as it had worked well at our previous sitting, I made no objection. During dinner, we discussed the implications of the sound of the drum. Flower argued that it definitely proved the honesty of the psychic. She had nothing to do in any normal way with the beating of that drum. How could she produce it with no drum in the house? What about the voices which came from the cone? I can't see how she could have had any share in the voices, and yet I am not satisfied. I want to cover her lips with my hand while Wilbur is speaking, and I want to control both her hands at the exact moment when the cone is in the air. "All that you can have," he replied. On our return to the upper chamber, we found Mrs. Smiley as we had left her, still in deep trance. Nothing had been changed. Every tack, every stitch was in place. We took seats as before at the end of the table. Mitchell now asked us, speaking through Maudie, to move the table away and put the cone in its place. This we did, expecting some new demonstration, but nothing came of it. His experiment, whatever it was, did not come off. I did not lay this up against him, however, for such failures are often of value as evidences of intention. We put the table back in its former place, stood the cone upright in its center, and laid several marked and numbered sheets of paper and a pencil beside it. Almost immediately, a measured clicking like the sound of a pencil on the cone began. "Is that you, Wilbur?" I asked. In answer, the cone swung into the air, and a vigorous, throaty whisper came from it. "Yes." "I want to ask a few questions." "Proceed." "Can the psychic be awake and speak normally while you are present and speaking?" "Yes, we have planned that." At this moment, the psychic seemingly passed into a painful struggle for breath, and then a few moments later she spoke to us in her quiet, gentle voice. "What time is it?" "8:30. How do you feel?" "Very numb and cold," she plaintively replied. "I can believe that. You've been sitting there 5 hours. Is anyone here?" "Yes, Wilbur is here. Or was a few moments ago." I addressed the air. "Are you still here, Wilbur?" The cone again swung into the air, and Wilbur replied still more clearly, "Yes, still here." One strange fact must now be noted. All through this sitting, as at the previous sittings, neither of the invisibles spoke directly to the psychic. They spoke of her, but never to her. They alluded to her as our instrument, but they never asked, "Mary, how do you feel? Can we do anything for you?" Even her daughter Maudie spoke of her as Mama, but never said, "Mama, do you want a drink?" as a child would do. Observing these facts, I wondered if the spooks were not merely doubles of her psychic sub-self. "Wilbur," I said, "I don't like all this long-distance experiment. I ask the privilege of going to Mrs. Smiley's side. I want to get closer to this mystery. I want to make absolutely sure that she does not use her hands." "You shall have that privilege," he replied. "Shall I go now?" I persisted. He did not reply, but 3 feeble raps on the cone signified a doubtful consent. Creeping slowly forward, guided by the thread which I held, I took a seat at her left hand. "I am close to the source of the phenomena now," I said as I placed my hand on her wrist. "Proceed, Wilbur." With tense expectation, I leaned over and put my ear close to the psychic's lips, and as I listened to her faint breathing, the horn soared into the air and was drummed upon as if to show that 2 hands were at work, and that my control of the psychic's wrist made no difference. But no word came from the cone. Marvelous as this demonstration was, I remained unsatisfied. "Wilbur, your silence is suspicious," I said aloud. "Can't you prove to me that your voice is independent of the psychic's organs of speech? Can't you give me a decisive test right now?" He did not reply, but while my hand was still on the psychic's wrist, please remember that both her sleeves were nailed to the chair. The loose leaves of paper on the table 4 feet from her hands rustled as if they were being gathered together and written upon. At last they were whisked away to the left. I distinctly heard them fall upon a sofa near the door several yards away. "There is no justice in charging this movement up to the psychic," I remarked. "Flower, you or Mrs. Flower may be accused of whisking those papers away, but Mrs. Smiley's left hand had nothing to do with it. So far as her normal powers are concerned, she is innocent of any share in it. During the flight of the paper, she did not move a finger of her left hand. Flower, are you controlling your wife's hands?" "I am. She had nothing to do with causing that noise. Apparently, those sheets of paper have been placed on the couch in the corner. I can't see any loophole. You have demonstrated that the flight of those papers was supernormal." "Yes," I replied. "We seem to have done just that." Addressing the guys, Flower said, "May I also go forward?" A decided no was tapped. "Why do you not speak, Wilbur? Do you want me to change places with Flower and control his wife's hands?" Instead of a voice, 3 sharp raps answered, "Yes." "They seem as anxious for a conclusive test as you are," remarked Flower. "Wilbur, do you mean that you want Mrs. Flower controlled by Garland?" A rapid fusillade of raps replied, "Yes, yes, yes." Flower now came forward to Mrs. Smiley's side while I returned to the table and took both of Mrs. Flower's hands in mine. "I want to set my big shoes on the tips of your slippers," I explained. "You will then be wholly eliminated from the test." She consented, and I put my huge soles on her toes. She could not move her hand or foot. At this precise moment, while Flower was pressing the psychic's imprisoned right wrist and I was in control of Mrs. Flower's hands and feet, the cone rose and banged about most furiously, describing wide circles in the high air, motions which gave at the moment perfectly convincing proof that the psychic had no normal hand in the performance. As the same movement had taken place while I was in control of the psychic, Each one of us was now completely absolved of any complicity in the action. "Mrs. Smiley," I said, "I want Flower to return to a seat, and I would like permission to place my hand over your lips or to muffle you with a handkerchief in order to demonstrate that you have nothing to do in any normal way with the production of these voices. Will you permit this test?" "Certainly," she answered with patient sweetness. "You may gag me in any way you please. I am sure you can secure the proof you want." Acting upon this permission, I took a large silk handkerchief from my pocket and tied it tightly around her head and over her mouth, knotting it at the back. In some excitement, I then challenged the ghostly voice. "Now, Wilbur, let's hear from you." A moment later, he spoke seemingly from the cone, but his voice sounded muffled and blurred. "You are not articulating well," I observed sarcastically. Instantly, the voice rang out sharply, more sharply than ever before. "I was fooling you," he said with a chuckle. "I know what you wanted, and so I gave it to you." I applauded. "There, that's better. Your voice has improved wonderfully." "I've taken a lozenge," was his whimsical reply, and his tone expressed the delight which a joker takes in a successful trick. Flower then said, "Let's consider this test for a moment, Garland. Let us suppose Mrs. Smiley has been able to loosen your gag. How did she handle the cone? Let us say she is a marvelous ventriloquist. How does she handle the pads in the center of the table? And how does she gather up our sheets of paper and whisk them away? It is not only a matter of voices, but of action. All that has happened, every phase of the seance, must come into the discussion. Mrs. Smiley has met every test." To this I replied, "I admit that everything points to an exercise of supernormal force. The movement of the cone appears, so far as anything in the dark can appear, to be caused by the action of etheric hands. I still think the phenomena are controlled by the psychic in some subconscious way." "I don't see how you can escape the spirit hypothesis," replied Flower. "What about the voices of Wilbur and Mitchell and Mrs. Flower's father? What about the spectral drum?" To this I could only say, "I don't know. A man can will to believe. I must await further evidence. I want to examine the gag, and I want to hold both of the psychic's hands. Will you permit that, Wilbur?" There was no reply to this, and Flower offered an explanation. "We had that test at a previous sitting." Again I addressed the invisible. "Wilbur, it is absolutely essential that you should prove to me that your voice does not come from the vocal cords of the psychic." I turned to Mrs. Smiley. "You see the importance of this, don't you, Mrs. Smiley?" "Indeed I do," she earnestly answered, her voice sounding very faint and muffled through her kerchief. "I am anxious for the test." "Very well then. Now I want you to hum a tune, and while you're singing I want Wilbur to speak. Will you do that, Wilbur?" The cone was drummed upon in sign of vigorous assent. While Mrs. Smiley sang, or rather hummed, we listened for Wilbur's voice, but no word came. A moment later she called faintly, "The kerchief is slipping down, Mr. Garland." Going to her side, I untied the kerchief. She said plaintively, "I'm so sorry we didn't get the voices as you wanted them. I'm sure we can if we try again." A vigorous drumming on the cone seconded her plea, but no spirit spoke. However, it was getting very late, and I said, "I think we will postpone further experiment tonight. You have endured enough. How do you feel?" "Almost paralyzed. I can't move, and I am partly deaf. But that often happens. My feet are quite dead. I cannot feel the floor. It is as if I had no feet at all. But your mind and speech appear to be perfectly normal. Yes, I am wide awake mentally." Soon after I returned to my seat, the cone was lifted high in the air silently and broken apart, an action requiring 2 hands, and then with the small end jamming inside the larger one, it was carried in a circle over the table and dropped to the floor. It fell with a bang which seemed to indicate disgust. "That means goodbye," said Mrs. Smiley. Upon lighting the gas, we found our poor little victim sitting exactly as we had placed her and bound her. The table edge was exactly 24 inches from her fingertips, and the place where the cone lay was 36 inches from the one hand and 40 inches from the other. But most inexplicable of all the phenomena on a tangible record of supernormal force was the transfer of our 7 sheets of paper from the table to the couch. They lay on the cushion 16 measured feet from Mrs. Smiley's left hand. And not only had they been written upon, they had been brought together and a black pin had been thrust through them. The pin had pierced the writing. To do this, vigorous and skilled use of 2 hands was necessary. Only 2 deft and powerful hands could hold those sheets and thrust the pin through them. On examination, we found that Wilbur had scrawled his name on one sheet, and on another sheet Mrs. Flower's father's name was signed to a tender message along with several other signatures unknown to any of us. The pencil was on the carpet 40 inches from Mrs. Smiley's hand. The leaves of paper at the moment when they were grasped and lifted were more than 40 inches from the psychic's fingertips. How this was done I cannot conceive, I said to Flower, but I am absolutely certain that the psychic did not remove them from the table by means of her ordinary hands, for they were controlled by mine. Barring the failure to dissociate her voice from that of Wilbur, our psychic had met every demand we had made upon her. Her powers are truly magical, I reported to the society. I cannot say that I saw the pencil move, but I assert that the psychic did not touch it. She did not write the names upon the papers. I could not swear that Flower was controlling his wife's hands while the cone was floating and while I held the psychic's imprisoned hands, but I believe that he was. In short, excluding the sense of sight, an all-important sense test, I admit, these happenings were at the moment convincing. They fitted in with many similar phenomena which I had secured in the presence of other psychics. But I was not yet satisfied. We needed a fifth person in the circle in order that Flower and I might control both of the psychic's hands at the precise moment that Mrs. Flower's hands were also secured. So long as a single hand is left free, the doubter will question our results. 2 of the sittings which followed were partial failures, so much so that I made a record of them. Possibly conditions were not strict enough. At any rate, the final and most conclusive sitting came a week later. It was held in the same room under the same conditions as those recorded above, but with the addition of a friend of Mrs. Flower, a young man who claimed some psychic power. We will call him Frank. Again, I took entire charge of the psychic and made certain that her bonds were even more carefully stitched and nailed than before. I began the seance as usual by a low humming chant which put Mrs. Smiley to sleep, and very soon Maudie spoke, saying, "Mr. Mitchell wishes the thread again fastened to Mama's hands in the way Mr. Garland desires," a command which gave further evidence of the hearty and intelligent cooperation of the invisibles. In addition to the tape stitched to her sleeves and nailed to her chair, I now fastened a strong thread to each wrist as I had done so many times before, passing the ends under the chair arm in such a wise that any slightest movement of the psychic's arms would be plainly and instantly registered. I then returned to my seat. Conditions seemed favorable, but no marked phenomena took place. The cone was lifted, it is true, but this we now accepted as a commonplace preliminary to something more startling. At 6 o'clock, the voice of Maudie came, directing us to go down to supper. "Mr. Mitchell says he will be able to give you what you ask for after you return." I had no notion what Mr. Mitchell had in mind, but my most dominant desire was to prove that his voice was not dependent upon the psychic's vocal cords. At dinner, we discussed this. "If Mrs. Smiley will let me put my hand over her mouth while Wilbur is speaking," I said, "I shall be satisfied." Flower's eyes gleamed with humor. "Do you mean that you will then believe in spirits?" he demanded. "Oh no, I won't go so far as to promise that," I hastened to protest. "But I confess that it would help me to infer their existence. Let's fix our minds on 2 things. First, to secure writing, or at least movement, with every hand controlled. And second, to get the voices while Mrs. Smiley's mouth is covered by your hand or mine." "Very well," Flower agreed. "We'll try, but it is often the unexpected which happens in performances of this kind." We were away from the psychic but 20 minutes, so eager were we for further demonstration. We found everything quite as when we left. She was asleep, the fastenings undisturbed. Flower and I at once regained our threads and resumed our places at the sides of the table while Frank and Mrs. Flower sat side by side at the end opposite Mrs. Smiley. I must again remind the reader that the psychic's ankles were encircled with tape which was nailed to the floor behind her chair, and that 2 bands of tape which had been sewed into her cuffs were tacked solidly to the chair. In addition to all these precautions, 3 strong upholstery tacks had been driven down through the hem of her dress into the floor. And finally, Flower and I were holding the threads which encircled her wrists. In spite of all these bonds, the cone was immediately lifted, and Mitchell spoke through it in a deep, clear, well-delivered, and decidedly masculine tonal whisper. In stately periods, he promised the complete cooperation of the spirit world in the great work to which I was devoting myself. He directed his exhortation to me and not to Flower, and for the benefit of those who think the spirits are always trivial or foolish, I wish to say that Mitchell's remarks were dignified and thoughtful. He was old-fashioned in his phrasing, but never vague or wandering in his thought. I observed, however, that he never went outside the circle of Mrs. Smiley's intellectual interests or transcended her thinking. For fully a quarter of an hour he discussed with me the value of my investigation, assuring me, as they all do, that he and his band were working as hard from their side as we were from ours. "We are as intent upon establishing channels of communication between the 2 worlds as you are, and I respectfully urge you to proceed in your grand work." At last he said, "Goodbye for the present," and deposited the cone on the table. Maudie then spoke from the psychic's lips. "If Mr. Garland and Mr. Flower will quietly go up to Mama's side, holding all the time tightly to the threads, Mr. Mitchell will do what Mr. Garland so much desires. Please be very careful not to touch Mama until I tell you. Keep as far apart as you can as you go up to her. When you reach her side, you may put 1 hand on her head and 1 on her wrist. Mr. Mitchell says to please have Frank take Mrs. Flower's hand so that every hand in the circle is accounted for. I was now eager and very alert. At last, after many requests and many trials, I was about to secure a clear, complete, and satisfying demonstration. Surely no trickster would permit such vigorous control as that towards which we were now invited. My admiration went out to our heroic little psychic who was enduring so much discomfort for my sake. She believes in her guides, I said. If she succeeds in this test, all honor to her. Slowly we crept to her side, being careful to touch nothing until directed by the voice of Maud. At last the childish voice said, "Mr. Garland may put his right hand on the top of Mama's head and his left hand on her wrist. Mr. Flower may place his left hand upon Mr. Garland's right hand and his right hand on Mama's right wrist. Mr. Mitchell says he will then try to have the voices come." I did as I bid, then said aloud, "My right hand is on the psychic's head. My left is on her left wrist." Flower repeated, "My left hand is resting on Garland's right hand, which is on the psychic's head, and my own right hand is controlling the right wrist of the psychic. Now, Wilbur, go ahead." Our challenge was almost instantly accepted. Despite this double safeguarding, the cone which had been resting on the table a few yards away rose with a sharp metallic sound and remained in the air for fully half a minute, during which I called out sharply, "We are absolutely controlling the psychic. Her hands are motionless. Mrs. Flower, are you holding both of Frank's hands?" "Yes, I have both his hands in mine," she answered. As the cone was gently returned to the carpet, Flower was moved to say, "Garland, that is the supreme test. The psychic was absolutely not concerned in any known physical way with that movement. Save for a curious throbbing wave-like motion in her scalp, she did not stir. If she lifted the horn, it was by the exercise of a force unrecognized by science." To this I was forced to agree, and I here definitely declare that the psychic was not concerned in any way with this flight of the cone. If she produced the voices, they too must have been examples of supernormal ventriloquism, for they came through the megaphone. Of that I am as certain as anyone can be of an auditory impression. A few minutes later we returned to our seats, and Wilbur, Mitchell, and several other voices conversed with us. Flower, now that I had admitted telekinesis, wanted me to go further. "Is the psychic now speaking to us?" he asked, "or are these voices independent of her?" "An investigator is never satisfied," I answered. "I must have the voices through the cone at the exact moment when I am covering the psychic's mouth." To this Mitchell replied, "We are doing all that we can now, but we will soon be able to meet every demand you make upon us." "I am anxious for conviction," I said. "I want to secure the voice of the psychic and your voice at the same time, Dr. Mitchell. Can you do that for me?" He seemed to hesitate and at last said, "We will try." I perceived in his tone a certain doubt and indecision. Again, we were permitted to hold the psychic's wrists and head, while as before the cone was lifted and drummed upon as if by two hands, indicating its position high in the air, but no voices came. Hidden forces appeared to be struggling for escape beneath our hands. The woman's brain seemed to be a powerful dynamo. I could not rid myself of the feeling that there was an actual externalization of the psychic's nerve force, and with this conviction I could well understand why the command had so often been given not to touch her unbidden. If her astral body were abroad, a strong light turned suddenly upon it might prove a dangerous shock. Now came a singularly engrossing game of hide-and-seek. Convinced that Mrs. Smiley was innocent of any trick in the movement of the cone, I tried every expedient to satisfy myself that Wilbur's voice was independent of her own. But I did not quite succeed. Mrs. Smiley spoke almost at the same time, but never precisely at the same moment with Wilbur. She was now fully awake and answered all my questions calmly and readily, lending herself eagerly to my experiment. All in vain. At no time did I succeed in getting Wilbur's voice at exactly the same moment as her own, though the whisper, following swiftly on her speech, interjected remarks as if echoing her questions. There was always a perceptible interval between her voice and his whisper. This was to me a very significant fact, and strengthened me in the impression that the entire series of happenings, while inexplicable, was after all the work of the medium. Miracles were taking place, but they were all within a short radius of her body and somehow related to it. When the gas was lighted, we found the cone had been placed on the table at a distance of 40 inches from the utmost reach of the psychic's hands. Her feet were 23 inches from the nearest leg of the table. We carefully examined the tapes which encircled her wrists and were sewed to her sleeves. They were tied in the double dance precisely as described so many times. To remove the tacks, we were forced to use a hammer. The talk of a possible release of her arms during the phenomena of the cone is absurd. Had she freed her arms, she could not have renailed herself to her chair. As I was about to leave the house that night, Mrs. Smiley said, "I do not feel able to sit any more for the present, Mr. Garland. I feel myself growing weaker, and the weather depresses me. Mr. Mitchell tells me I would better stop for the moment. I feel that my power belongs to the world, and I want especially to convince you of the truth of spiritualism. But the strain is too great." "I grant that," I responded. and I cannot blame you for demanding a rest. No one could have endured our tests more uncomplainingly. You have been a model subject, and we are deeply in your debt. I am sorry Dolbear was not with us tonight. He would at least have been convinced of your supernormal power. Have no fear of my report. I have found you honest and very patient. I thank you most sincerely for what you have done. Having shared more than 30 of these exciting sittings with Mrs. Smiley, each one more rigid than the others, I had gained a sincere respect for her courage and her patience. Believing her mediumship to be a dangerous tax on her physical organism, I admired her devotion to her faith, for to her it was a faith, a religion. She was poor, not strong physically, and yet she had stayed on in our harsh climate, subjecting herself to a dangerous strain night after night with no promise of pay, seeking to convince me and others like me of the reality of her voices. In addition to my formal reports, I submitted the following notations. 1. So far as the senses of touching and hearing go, Mrs. Smiley's arms and feet had nothing to do in any normal way with the movements of the cone, the table, or the pencils. 2. Her guides lent themselves intelligently to every test, and labored to make each experiment a success. They seemed at all times eager to have me exercise the most rigid control, but warned me not to go too far while the psychic was entranced or when her etheric body was at work. 3. That all the phenomena were accompanied by marked physiological changes in the psychic. Her convulsive movements, her groans and sighs, her writhing as she passed from one state of consciousness to another were at times so moving that Mrs. Flower and others of the sitters demanded her release. Her temperature fell, her hands became cold and clammy, and at a certain stage her breath and pulse became so faint as to be almost imperceptible. All these symptoms, in my judgment, were not under the control of her will and argued a close connection with the phenomena. 4. My impressions of her performances as a whole were favorable to her mediumship. The movements of the horn took place just as I have described them, but I am not ready to admit that Wilbur and Mitchell are spirits. I grant the existence of all the phenomena, but differ from Flower and Allen in my interpretation of them. Insofar as I have gone, Wilbur and Mitchell impress me as distinct personalities, but they may be dream people. 5. As to voices, I have no theory, far less an explanation. They may be ventriloquistic. 6. That the psychic when sitting is under great strain would appear from the fact that she was sadly convulsed by Dolbear when he jerked the thread attached to her wrist, and that once, when I, with the full consent of the guides, passed between her hands and the table, brushing the fingers of one hand, she was again convulsed and unable to proceed. It appears that some part of her substance exteriorizes itself during these trances. Furthermore, her entire body and brain seems aroused to abnormal action. Flower's description of her brain as a dynamo fitted my concept. As I rested my hand on her head, it seemed semi-liquid. It did not throb, it appeared to wave under my palm. This may have been merely an action of the scalp, but in any case, a highly wrought condition of the brain was indicated. The temperature of her hands in every sitting fell markedly. A mere touch revealed this, and her pulse and breathing varied abnormally. I did not register her temperature with the thermometer, however, nor did I take her pulse with an instrument. These physiological changes led me to treat the psychic with care. I found that by proceeding gently and quietly along desired lines, I was able to tighten control on her limbs. If my control was not absolute, the fault was mine, not hers. She made no objection to any of my restraining devices. 7. On the mental side, I observed that when she was disturbed by a sense of our discomfort, or when she knew a sitter was worried about losing a train, nothing happened. Whenever she was overeager for results, or when one of her sitters became impatient for any cause, the phenomena diminished in power. Without doubt, it was because of the serenity she felt in Dolbear's study that the powers were strongest. Similarly in Flower's home. Even though the control was doubly rigid, she was entirely at ease. She did not appear to will the phenomena, but to passively await the action of the invisibles. That her health was affected by the climate was evident. Some of the failures were due to the severe winter weather. As the time came for her to return to her home, 5 members of the board united in a letter thanking her for her uncomplaining cooperation in their severe tests. Quote, "We feel that the conditions which we found it necessary to impose fell upon you with peculiar hardship considering the state of your health. But no word of complaint from you was heard, nor have you raised any objection to control. However meager the results may seem to you, they are to us exceedingly interesting, and we hope at some future time to have your most valued aid again." End quote. To this she replied December 11th, thanking us for our, quote, "forbearance and patience." I am sure no psychic could ask more. While the conditions were rigid, there has been nothing but a spirit of gentleness and patience manifested, no matter how wearing and disappointing the sittings have been. I understand perfectly the necessity of rigid conditions and am sorry not to have been in the best of physical health for the sittings." End quote. In closing this series of experiments, I wish the reader to see them as they were, carefully prepared and calmly studied, always in the spirit of modern science. The invisibles worked harmoniously with us, often with humor. We jested with them as well as among ourselves. With the exception of the darkened room, the conditions were all we desired them to be. You've been listening to Classic Paranormal's reading of 40 Years of Psychic Research by Hamlin Garland. Be sure to click into the succeeding episodes until the book is complete. Until then, followers of the freaky, aficionados of the afterworldly, connoisseurs of the creepy, stay spooky. Before you go, consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.